Excellent. Welcome back to our first ever World Coronavirus Virtual Conference. The idea of gathering all the speakers who have something to say from around the world right now is live, and we are with Ben Aris. Ben Aris from IntelliNews. He's been editor and IntelliNews, BNE IntelliNews agency is majority of the time they're covering the emerging markets. So we are going to discuss about effect of COVID-19 on emerging markets. Hello, Ben.
Hi, how you doing?
Thank you very much. How was your day?
It's good. Sorry, my wife is trapped on the balcony.
That's fine.
1 second.
Yeah. So how is your day and how your livelihood has changed because of the COVID-19?
Well, I've been joking that I've been in self-isolation for about 25 years, in as much as I've always worked at home. Oh. So for me, it's no difference. The difference actually is I have 3 teenage bored boys roaming around the apartment because they can't go to school. But other than that, my life is exactly the same as normal.
Excellent. So you are right now you live from Berlin, right?
Berlin, yes.
How's life different? In short, if you can explain how Berlin is different before COVID-19 and after.
It's changed. We don't have a strict lockdown here, but then that's partly, I think, the German mentality, in so much as they're sort of serious people. They've been reading the news, and Merkel has been on TV regularly giving updates, and so we've actually been very well informed. And when they introduced all the measures like social distancing, that came pretty quickly, and the people have just adhered to it. Although it's tightening. I mean, I was in the supermarket 2 weeks ago, and people were being cautious, but in the meantime, now there's a security guard. They only let 10 people in at a time. And there's tape on the floor showing you where 1.5 meters is. And so throughout the entire supermarket, everybody's keeping their distance. There's a man who sprays disinfectant on the trolley when you go in. Mm-hmm. And it's gone from a sort of sense of being nervous to, I think, resignation. And even in the queue on the street outside, everybody's adhering to the social distancing. So, and of course, the curve here is already flattening without a strict lockdown. Oh. But everyone, I think, is a bit fed up. They're just waiting for this to be over. But in the meantime, they're doing what they have to do in order to make it pass quickly.
Yeah, well, I think the measures you're talking about is like adopted by many countries, and even in my city, I hear a lot of things that the practices you were talking about Berlin is the same. But it is interesting and funny how different countries are taking a different approach, and whatever plays with them, right? Some countries are very strict, and some countries, like Nordic countries, for instance, they are more mild. And some people say that because the social distance have been there before, it became mainstream.
It's interesting. It shed some light on different societies' attitude to social responsibility. And Germany has always been, it had the first ever Green Party in power in Germany. And so they take all these things seriously. They believe in their democracy. And the argument has been social distancing, because the young people, like in the States, have said, like, it's not going to affect me. I get sick and I get better. It's old people's problem. But then it was explained that you should isolate in order to stop the infection spreading so it doesn't get to the old people. And that really made sense to the Germans, so that it's my duty to do this. So they did it. Whereas in several other countries, they're just like, it doesn't affect me, so why should I care?
Yeah, so more of a disciplined country. So, well, yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of similarities. We can talk about that. But at the moment, I would like to, first of all, let's talk about the topic you wanted to cover. And being from emerging market, from myself. And we see that developed countries definitely are handling it, or let's not say handling it, but the effect on developing countries will be less severe than in emerging markets because of the different economies. Yeah. So let's cover. Yeah. Let's talk about what is going to be the effect of coronavirus to emerging markets, sir.
So, B&E Intellinews, we specialize in emerging Europe, Central, Southeast, Eastern Europe, into Central Asia, North Africa. And we have a wide spectrum of countries, and the attitude of those countries is also very different.
Mm-hmm.
You have some countries like Turkey and Belarus, where the leaders have refused to take this seriously. They just denied it was a problem. And as a consequence of that, the virus is spreading out of control. Turkey, until last week, I think, said it had no virus infections at all. And now it's got the fastest growing infection rate in the whole region. In Russia is an example of one where they were relatively slow to respond.
Yes.
But when they did, and typically countries go into lockdown after the 10th person has died, they went the whole hog, and Moscow has been locked down entirely. I was talking to colleagues there this morning, and they were saying, you know, if you go outside your house, you'll be arrested. So it's extremely strict. And although the infection rate is growing quite quickly, it seems to have been contained largely in Moscow. They're still in the first few thousand. And severity of the traffic in malls has collapsed down to 75% reductions. And this is another interesting thing. I mean, you're saying that developed markets are doing well, but one of the advantages of being an emerging market with poor rule of law is that it gives the government the ability to impose extremely strict regime, which would, the thing with Germany is actually you don't have the legal authority to lock down a society completely. Whereas
Yes.
in Russia, you can just order it. And although the Russians are complaining and saying, you know, on what legal basis are you telling me to stay at home? Nobody's going outside, because now if they do and they get arrested, they have to pay a 5,000 ruble fine, and they will be made to pay that. So that lack of democracy, that lack of rule of law is actually an advantage in this situation, which gives the authorities the ability to respond. And we're seeing already in Southeast Europe and Central Europe, countries like Poland, Czech, the curve, the curve is already flattening somewhat, because the social distancing is being imposed and is being made to work. In Eastern Europe, in Belarus or Ukraine, it's growing very fast, but exponentially, but we're still talking about very small numbers. So once it moves out to the general population, again, you can expect the curve to flatten. And it's an existential problem for all these countries, because they don't have the resources, they don't have the medical systems to cope with an influx, a large influx of a lot of very sick people. So they need to contain it. Otherwise, the death toll is going to be very high.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, basically the imposing, but I think many people agree to those conditions because they've seen in a good example, or like positive example, of South Korea and China, where strict, let's say, they were like stating it as draconian measures given a good result. And as a matter of fact, from the city where everything has emerged, the Wuhan, right now, after 2 months, back into the country, and the city is going back to normal life. And the strict laws there have proven. So I think many countries are trying to copy that, because it never been experienced in such a way. And what about we're talking about lockdown and the different policy measures to actually hold it, but what about aftermath? So how different markets and how emerging markets will cope with the after effect, or what's going to be after coronavirus infection being sort of diminished?
Yeah. This is a huge shock to the economies of the region. And it's already clear now that this is going to be a bigger shock than even the 2008 crisis. And, in all these markets, we've been through multiple crises. I mean, starting with 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then in 98, the Asian debt crisis, which spilled over into Eastern Europe, 2004, 2008 to 2014, the last oil shock. But all of these crises, in some ways, has played to the advantage of some countries in the region. in so much as that they're battle worn. You know, this is new for a country like Germany, which is going to see whatever 20% drop in GDP second quarter. But for someone like Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, they've been through this before many times. And going into this crisis, the long-term repercussions will depend on how developed, how much progress the country has made, and B, how much preparation it's done for another crisis. And there, the spectrum is extremely wide. And if we take two obvious examples and compare Ukraine and Russia, that the last oil shock in 2014, we had a similar thing. We had oil drop down to whatever it was, $30. We had run on the currency, massive devaluations. We had burning through hard currency reserves, and everybody was very scared. And a lot of economic damage was done. But since 2014, countries like Russia have deleveraged. They've got rid of their debt. Because there's this attitude, never again. We know what happens. We know what a crisis looks like. We've lived through it recently. Let's get ready for the next one. All of these emerging markets realize that they're unstable. And consequently, Russia's paid off its debt, no external debt at all, in practical terms. It has enough cash to cover its debt, dollar for dollar in cash. It has built up massive reserves of $580 billion. It's more than a year of import cover. It's excessive. But it means that in 2014, they nearly had a budget crisis because they had a whole 2 trillion ruble hole in the budget, which they couldn't cover. This time, they're going to have the same 2-3 trillion hole in the budget, but the reserves they have are enough to finance this for 10 years, which means that the budget spending in the budget plan can be carried out as normal with no change, except rather than getting the money from taxes, you just dip into your reserve fund. And there's enough money in there, so says the finance minister, for at least 10 years. There's at least 3 years, we're sure of that. But then you compare that to a country like Ukraine. I mean, they went through their Euromaidan popular uprising in 2014. It has 2 months of hard currency reserves. The economy is already struggling. They need to put through massive reforms. They need to put in place massive investment. And they're looking at a contraction this year. I mean, it was growing between 3 and 4%. And they're looking at a contraction this year of 8-9% if things carry on for more than a couple of months. The budget deficit is going to double to 4 or 5% of GDP, and they just don't have the money to cover that. So a country like Ukraine is facing default on its international obligations. It has to have an IMF program, which they haven't signed. And they have an oligarch there called Ihor Kolomoisky, who's actually working actively to derail the IMF program. So they have enormous problems. And the country was already, the incomes there are already the lowest or second lowest in Europe. And it's going to get worse. And the upshot of all of this is that because so far this is a public health crisis, and the expectation is the virus will burn out in about 2 months. So there will be a rebound, and all the economists are saying in Q3, Q4 that the economies will start to recover, but of course damage is done, it won't get back to the same level as before. But in somewhere like Russia, they can start the process of rebuilding pretty quickly and everyone can go back to work. In a country like Ukraine or Tajikistan or Moldova or any of those, have massive debts, they're going to have massive budget deficits, they're going to have a step down in quality of life that will take years to rebuild. They're going to need serious financial help, and really the only person in that game is the IMF. And so the IFIs, the International Financial Organizations, are going to play a key role for the recovery of those countries, where other countries like, I don't know, Azerbaijan or Russia, which have more resources, are going to be able to fend for themselves. And they'll probably do quite well out of this. They'll improve their standing. But you're going to get a wider diversification of progress within the region as a result of this. And some of the emerging markets, like Russia, will take another step towards becoming fully emerged, because it's going to play a role on the international stage as well. I mean, it's going to help other countries in the region. It's going to earn political brownie points. It's got to be part of the international rescue effort. It's got to be play a key role in G20. And the poorer countries are actually going to be knocked back. They weren't making much progress, but they're going to be knocked even further back.
I see. So regarding the recession type, so if you break down to a regions, so who's going to have a V recession? Who's going to have a U recession line? Who's going to have a L recession? Is it possible to make such a feasibility analysis?
There's various things you can look at. It sort of basically comes down to the setup. So how much do you have in the way of debt? And most of the countries are relatively unindebted because they're emerging and they haven't had the ability to build up much debt. So that's a good thing. And having low debt allows you to bounce back relatively quickly. And there they stand in stark contrast to Western Europe, where everybody has very large debts, like Spain, Italy, of course, being the worst case. And they run the danger of having a sovereign debt crisis, which would be a disaster for the whole world. The second thing you have to look at is the level of reserves. And again, it's a very mixed picture. I mean, you're sitting in Tashkent. In Tashkent, the government actually has very large hard currency reserves, half of which is in solid gold. And so a country like Uzbekistan will probably recover from this pretty quickly, pretty easily, because they have the cash in the bank. Russia's in that boat. Belarus isn't, Ukraine isn't. Central European countries are, they've just been through a 5-year boom. So they have a lot of resources and they have that momentum as well that will help carry them out. The Balkans, again, the smaller countries, but they're exposed because somewhere like Croatia, a third of the GDP is generated by tourism. And so all the countries down there on the Dalmatian coast are going to take a huge hit this year. But if the pandemic does die out in 2 or 3 months, then it should go back to normal for the next year's season. And so they should be able to bounce back relatively quickly. And because their industry is tourism, a service industry, it's a lot more flexible. It's not like heavy industry. It's not like manufacturing, which is more predominant in Central Europe. But then in Central Europe, their economies are a lot more diversified, which makes them more robust anyway. And they have the wherewithal, the resources, the hard currency reserves, etc., in order to bail themselves out. And their low debt means they can also borrow their way out as well. So it's really the basket cases that are in big trouble. Places like Tajikistan, Moldova, Belarus.
Yeah. Well, you were mentioning before about the IMF, and at the moment, such countries who doesn't have that much of privilege of having, let's say, the gold reservoirs or the cash, they have to face it to some financial institutes. And I recently read that IMF released $200 million to Kyrgyzstan, being the first stimulus plan to combat the COVID-19 aftermath. And Kyrgyzstan is buying, and they're releasing the money to medical part. And do you think that's going to be a common practice? Do you think many countries going to go after IMF, and what IMF is going to do about it if they have so many people, if they have so many other countries trying to ask for money?
Again, the IMF, yeah?
Yes, IMF, and how IMF is going to deal with if every country is going to go after, and they will be, claiming for some sort of loans or concession loans or any kind of money to combat the effects. I can hear you.
Yeah, I'm good. So let's start. I'll answer your question.
Yes.
But the IMF is going to play so ready?
Yep.
So the IMF is going to play a key role here. It's the lender of last resort as far as countries are concerned. And the IMF has already said that some 85 countries from around the world have applied for help, of which we know that 9 of them are from our patch, from Central Eastern Europe. And the IFIs are going to pump in, the IMF says is making $1 trillion available. And there's, in addition, a new instrument called the Rapid Finance Instrument, where there's $50 billion, which has, normally the IMF makes its loans with a lot of conditionality, strings. And this RFI, this Rapid Finance Instrument, is just cash that goes straight into the budget, no strings attached, for dealing with the immediate problems of, I need to pay workers who are not working, I need to buy medical equipment, I need to pay doctors, I need to transport people. And is the follow-up with programs and facility. And given the recession that's likely to follow, given the countries are likely to face, given that many of them will burn through their reserves really fast. And on top of that, you have to bear in mind a lot of the poorer countries are extremely dependent on remittances. So yeah, the IMF is going to play a key role, and in the short term, countries have no choice except to go to the IMF, which is in effect the lender of last resort for countries. And a lot of them are running out of money. There's already a global shortage of dollars, and the IMF is the go-to place for that. They've already committed about $1 trillion in order to helping countries. Included in that is this new instrument called the Rapid Finance Instrument. And normally the IMF makes all its loans with a lot of conditionality, strings. And the thing with the RFI is that it's $50 billion that's just cash, no strings attached. And it's there for countries who need to pay doctors, who need to buy medical equipment, ventilators, who transport, who have immediate bonds that need to be paid. I mean, the cash, because everybody's income has been massively reduced. And another aspect of this is the remittances, because the poorer countries, particularly countries like Moldova, like Tajikistan, you know, a significant part of their GDP, in Tajikistan's case, it's as much as 30% of GDP is remittances. And those are all migrant workers who are in other countries. And those are exactly the jobs that are getting cut first. So in addition to having soaring unemployment and the poorest section of society losing their jobs, this is also going to bounce back on a lot of these poorer countries, because as much as 30% of their GDP is going to disappear overnight. And there's no other way of dealing it than going to the IMF for cash right now. But that's the immediate thing. Then going forward, given that we're expecting, you know, a significant contraction in all these countries, then it's going to roll out its more permanent plans, which are the standby arrangements, the extended fund facilities, and the IMF is going to get a lot more heavily involved in a lot of these emerging markets, the weaker ones, with these programs. And you've got countries that hate going to the IMF. I mean, it's not a popular organization because people don't like to be told what to do because of this conditionality. But the Iranians went to the IMF already for the first time since the 1960s, and the Belarusians have also applied for help, and the Belarusians loathe talking to the IMF. And even Turkey, Erdogan has castigated the IMF on many occasions. And so far they haven't asked, but the state of their economy is so atrocious, I don't see how he's going to avoid going to the IMF for a bailout because of the shock, the size of the shock. And the final question is, does the IMF have enough money? And actually, we don't think it does. It's got enough money from those 85 countries to deal with all the countries whose GDPs are about 100 billion or less. 100 billion is about the size of Ukraine, but Ukraine is a relatively small economy. For a country like South Africa and Turkey, those two countries alone would eat up half of the IMF's resources by itself. So already we're seeing a scramble now to find new resources that have never been seen before. I mean, the World Bank's going to kick in 10 billion, but that's really a drop in the bucket. I mean, we're talking trillions.
Yeah.
That's going to be immediately made available. And the European Union is talking about creating this new facility, a sort of pan-European bond that's issued by all the member states, which doesn't exist now. It's all done on a sovereign basis so far. And they're rushing to create this thing. So the IMF happily has enough money in a short term, next month or so, to deal with the immediate problems, but then going on from that, I mean, and we're talking only like a couple of months down the road, there's new sources of financing have to come from somewhere. And the bailout is going to be enormous. I mean, it's going to put the whole 2008 bailout to shame, and that drove everybody's debt to GDP up to 100%, you know. So this really is significant. I mean, it's our children's children are going to be paying for this for generations to come.
So you're saying that IMF will impose some sort of like a first come, first serve rule? They don't have how to pick to whom to give that money?
No, like as I say, the smaller countries, they can serve. They can serve. The smaller countries, they can help everyone immediately. And it's really the smaller countries that are having the most trouble.
Okay. So,
but as soon as bigger countries, particularly I'm looking at Turkey, South Africa, if they get into trouble, then that's a whole new ball game, and the IMF starts to run out of resources. And it's a question of time. It's a race against time, because the quicker you can bring the crisis to head it off with this wall of cash, then the less damage is done, the less financing you need to provide. So they need to act quickly, and happily this new RFI, this rapid instrument, is acting very quickly. And the hope is that you can contain the crisis, which makes it cheaper. The faster you contain it, the cheaper it becomes. But it's a race against time, and really it depends if something like Turkey goes off the rails in the meantime, then the whole crisis could escalate. It becomes even bigger and more serious than it is.
So you kind of scared me at the point where you said that the children of our children has to pay, and it's the consequences are even severe. It's going to be more severe than the last recession, or like when we compare to 2009. What is the stimulus plan? What is the magic plan for the countries? How countries can well, we're talking about emerging markets. Like in Canada, they're already imposing the very good stimulus plans and packages. United States is like releasing, like first time ever, such a huge amount of money, like $2.1 trillion US. But what about the emerging markets? Can they come up with some sort of stimulus plan? And if yes, like how they should and how they can support the economies and go back to what they were at least?
Like I said before, it's a kind of two-track deal. That the stronger markets, like Russia, will take care of themselves. And Russia was already into this whole program of the 12 national projects, which is a massive $400 billion investment program. And the question is whether it can finance that. And happily, the reserve funds that it has, it can finance that. So it will just continue to do that. But then that makes it a source of growth and investment within the region, which will suck in resources, which will help lift everybody else as well, because it provides work. For someone like Ukraine, their problems just got worse, in so much as they already needed a massive amount of investment. They already needed a massive amount of reform. And they have failed to attract any significant FDI. I mean, last year they took in $2 billion, which in a $100 billion economy is really not very much, because they have all these problems with the investment environment, the political instability, the war in the East, and so on and so forth. And will this crisis, I mean, this crisis is going to knock them back. It's going to make them even less attractive than it was before, because simply the amount of resources that are available are going to be reduced as a result of all of this. But then that's going to drive them into the arms of the IMF. And so the IMF, with its longer term programs, the standby or the extended fund facility, is going to play its traditional role. But like I say, we're going to see a two-speed recovery within the emerging markets, where the stronger countries will get on with the business of stimulating their economies for the sake of the domestic economy, consequently will faster. And then that accelerated growth will suck in what resources there are in terms of foreign investment. And so that will accelerate their growth, whereas the problem countries are going to get left further behind. And all said and done, an IMF program is great, but it's slow acting. It takes years and years to make a difference. And so those countries will take longer to catch up than they would have done before, and they were already trailing behind before this started.
Understand. So regarding the stimulus plan, all you're saying is it depends from the situation to situation, and when the countries were already dealing with the prosperity, and they were the countries which were already on a track of development, they're going to be catching up and having more chances rather than those countries who were like in more stagnation. In that essence, if IMF, let's say, out of picture because they ran out of cash, and for other stimulus or economic, let's say, the other funds, that the ones that you were talking about, the Eurobond, Euro Trust Bond, is again, it's not a long time coming, but it's not there yet, right? It's still discussions there. What do you think the role of the FDI be in the combating the effects of the COVID-19, foreign direct investment? Right now, what we know, they all hold back. So what is the situation with the FDI, and how FDI is going to look like in next 10 to 12 months?
Well, I mean, FDI is the sort of is the FDI is always much sought after. I mean, on the one hand, of course, it's cash, but also it's all the added value, the management skills, the technology that comes with it, the mentality, good corporate governance, good management practices. ESG is now a big theme, environment, social, and corporate governance. And so that's all imported along with the capital that comes with FDI. But to be honest, FDI hasn't played a massive role in the region, in my region anyway. In Central Europe, it did. But then that was all backed by the EU and the EU structural funds, and sort of huge amounts was being brought into infrastructure. And that dragged in with it, like the companies, German companies, French companies, Italian companies were just across the border because they were natural markets and close to home. So it made sense. And the further away you go from Europe, then there's this geographical line that the further you go, the less FDI you get, until you arrive in somewhere like Kyrgyzstan, Tashkent, Bishkek, Almaty. Then there's very, very little FDI other than in the raw materials, oil and gas, metals, you know, where those things are those global companies anyway. And in addition, you have the issues of the investment climate, and all these countries have struggled to create very attractive investment climates. And I don't see how the crisis is going to improve that. The only plus is going to be they're going to have to go and be and sign up for an IMF plan, which comes with all this stuff, with improving the laws, improving corporate governance, improving the investment climate so that investors feel comfortable. But what FDI is going into the region is also going to be slowed down just because of the financial problems all these companies are going to have at home. And after the raw materials, typically the next one to arrive is the retailers. IKEA is everywhere. Metro, the German wholesaler, is everywhere. But what we saw in Central Europe was that then you start getting light industry production, and then slowly that goes up the added value chain into things like TV, plasma TV screens, automotive. But that's a long, slow process too. And everyone's going to be desperate for investment. So I think the source of that investment capital is not going to be FDI. It's probably going to be IFI. People like the EBRD, the development banks, are going to play an increasingly important role, and they already are the biggest investor in many of these countries. And local capital markets. A big change we saw in the last year was that Clearstream, the clearance, the international clearing system, has opened up operations across the region, and it's now in Georgia, it's now in Russia. It started in April last year in Ukraine, and that took off massively. That brought in $5 billion. And again, we're going to live in a very low interest rates world. Everybody, the Fed has already cut to zero, and nobody's going to be able to hike rates for years while we come out of this. And that's the one place where the emerging markets have something to offer, because they will offer high interest rates. You know, the Ukrainian bonds started trading at 19%, and investors are going to be even more yield hungry than they used to be. And as a consequence, the bond markets of these emerging countries are going to be attractive, provided that the investors believe they're not going to default. But then if they have a decent IMF deal in the background, then that gives the investors a lot of comfort. And so capital markets should, I don't know, it becomes the main source of investment capital for governments, who can then raise, for budget spending. And so the investment stimulus, such as it is probably going to be done by the states in most of these countries with money that they've raised on the local bond markets or international bond markets.
Understood. Well, which leads me to my most probably the last part I want to cover, globalization versus localization. Because many countries are using, in many politics around the world, politicians around the world are using this opportunity to say that we need to make stuff domestically and playing it for their favor. And are they right? Do you think that globalization will be different? Do you think many countries will persuade the fact that China is no longer the go-to shop for your, manufacturing and production? Do you think that many countries will adapt to the fact that they're gonna produce majority of their consumed goods in their own countries, or will we go back to normal life in 1 year? It's going to be the same situation.
I think globalization has just taken a big hit, hasn't it? Because, pandemic, global virus it becomes global because of the globalization that, it appears in China and within a month it's in Seattle. And there's going to be a certain, the open border idea has just taken a blow, because everyone's going to ask if there's another outbreak, and there will be. Shouldn't we be able to close the borders? Maybe allowing free flow, unchecked, unregistered, untested is not such a good idea. But having said that, globalization was actually already in retreat before coronavirus appeared. And that was manifest in the trade war between China and America. And it was also manifest in the autarky that Russia has adopted, that it just joined the WTO, I think it was in 2012. And then by 2014, when the sanctions were imposed after it annexed Crimea, they imposed counter-sanctions on Europe, basically cutting all of Europeans' agricultural imports off. Famously, you couldn't get any cheese in Moscow because all the cheese was imported. Nobody bothered to make any domestic cheese. And since then, there's now Russian cheese. There's even Russian camembert, which is made in Siberia, for these places. And it's become a question of national security for the Kremlin to be self-sufficient in as much of these things as possible. And I think that is going to continue. There are going to be exceptions, of course. The automotive industry, for example. The key industries in Central European countries like Slovakia and Czech Republic, Turkey too, is an automotive. And those industries are explicitly looking at pan-European export. And also, there's also been the big retailers, as I said. Those are also explicitly pan-European multinationals. But I think for a lot of the production of things like food, basic goods, that there's going to be an emphasis now, an increased emphasis on having sufficient domestic capacity in order to cope with scenarios like this. and the ability to, fragment again Europe, to close borders in order to contain the spreads of viruses. So it's a change in mentality.
Okay, so yeah, so basically, which leads me to my very last question.
Changing because the China.
Then, so which leads me to my very last question, Ben. What is your suggestions and recommendations to governments, emerging market governments, and what would be your recommendation to emerging market private sector? If in a couple of words you can describe what they can do and act right now.
How the private sector can help?
Well, basically your suggestion to private sector in that right now, like what private sector can do in general essence, and what governments should do in order to support them.
What we've seen in just the last few weeks, like I may have mentioned earlier, that there's this new topic, ESG, and that was driven, it means ecology, social, and that was being driven by the threat of the global climate crisis. Mm-hmm. That companies, the Norwegian state pension fund has now explicitly banned investments into companies that are quote unquote dirty, producing lots of emissions. And in my part of the world, this hit some of the producers in Poland and particularly in Russia very hard, in so much as suddenly they lost huge amount of equity investors who are no longer allowed to invest into them. And that spurred them all to adopt these ESG policies. But the coronavirus has rapidly transformed that whole thing. So whereas you had someone like Norilsk Nickel spending $2 billion on reducing its sulfur dioxide emissions, in the last couple of weeks, all of these companies have rushed out medical testing for their staff, medical equipment for their companies, for their towns, because a lot of them are located in remote areas, and taking care of people, which in a way it's a sort of Soviet legacy thing, in so much as it's always been in the DNA of former Soviet bloc companies that they have a social responsibility. But that's been accelerated in a dramatic way. And we've seen companies giving money to the government. We've seen companies like pouring money into R&D, into producing test machines. The Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Russia Direct Investment Fund, has poured a huge amount of money and has developed together with the Japanese a portable suitcase-sized coronavirus testing kit, which didn't exist 2 months ago. And they're going into production with it already. And funnily enough, you're seeing a lot of these companies taking their social obligation seriously and spending significant amounts of money. And of course, they're starting with their own employees. But as I said, that means a whole town or city, because, yes, car plant like Avtovaz, the whole of Nizhny Novgorod city is dependent on this one plant. And the plant sees its employees not just as the guys who come to the factory, but the entire city. And so they're putting money into the city in order to make sure it's prepared to deal with this, which is a plus, it's a positive. They just need to deal with the corporate governance bit next.
Okay. Well, basically, I think that legacy and I think that what the last example you've said is resonating with Ford. For example, making the ventilators in America, like they pledged to make 50,000, and Elon Musk is doing like ventilators in his own factory, Tesla, and SpaceX, I think. So I think there is a lot of correlation in the fact that the other industries that are not purposed for that are just trying to combat and pay the piper in order to bring a value to help fighting against that. So I think more and more companies should adopt that, and it's a time to pay back to society and be responsible in the essence that, you know what, if who's gonna buy your cars, who's gonna buy your goods if this thing's gonna go for next year or so. So basically this makes it a good example. So Ben, I have many more questions, but as we said, we wanted to condense down and bring people to very essence and boil down information. So for now, thank you very much for your time. I wish you and your family health, and I think we're going to continue these kind of discussions later on. And I will put the links down below to Intel News, intelnews.com, so you can learn more about what this agency and the news outlet is doing. And thank you very much, Ben, for your time. Thank you.
It was a great pleasure.
Okay, thank you.